Hi, my name is Janae McKinley, and I am currently the 5th grade reading and 5th through 12th grade ELL teacher at Eagle Grove Community Schools. During the study, I was the 5th and 6th grade reading teacher, and that will show its importance as I continue through my presentation. I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Northern Iowa in 2012, and I majored in elementary and middle level education. I got endorsements. I got my literacy minor, Spanish teaching minor, coaching endorsement, and I'm currently completing my ELL endorsement. My research study was on the effects of the Frayer model on vocabulary acquisition. At my school, we have our teachers broken up into grade-alike teams. I was the 5th and 6th grade reading teacher, and so we had a 5th and 6th grade math teacher, 5th and 6th grade science, 5th and 6th social studies, and 5th and 6th language arts, as well as some specials teachers. So we had 4 teachers who were on 5th grade team who taught 5th and 6th grade, and we had 4 teachers who were on 6th grade team who taught 5th and 6th graders. So I was on the 5th grade team this particular school year, the 2014-2015 school year, and in the spring we were tasked with the job of analyzing the Iowa assessment results. We revealed that the 5th graders during the school year tested the lowest overall in the vocabulary portion of the test, and 41% of the students were not proficient on that test. So as we got to talking about it a little bit more, we also realized that the students really struggled in the area of vocabulary in their other content classes. So they were struggling in those areas as well. What we do then with this data is we specifically put students in certain sections, different classes. We have a step-up class for reading. We also have a STAMS course for math, and then we have various RTI groups. And so what we do is we analyze it in the spring after the students have taken it, and we kind of develop an idea for some groupings and some classes for the next school year. So my research that I conducted was based on this data, and that drove my instruction of the students for the next school year. So it's when I was testing them, when I was conducting the research, they were 6th graders, but it was based on their data in 5th grade. So the studies show that students with the richest vocabularies are the most successful in academic achievement. So because of that, and because of the data that we collected, I determined that vocabulary was an area that needed to be focused on. In our district, we have a growing number of ELL students as well as a high population of low SES students. That leads to the literature review. So when looking at some areas for vocabulary, I came across some strategies that were not effective, as well as strategies that were proven to be effective, or that the studies showed that they were effective. So merely memorizing vocabulary is an ineffective way to teach vocabulary. So having students read the vocabulary, come up with the definition, and just memorize those was not an effective way for students to understand the vocabulary. Studies showed that students needed time to be able to make connections to the words. So they needed to be able to connect their new knowledge to their prior learning. Students also need to have multiple exposures to the words, according to studies. Shows that they need to be purposeful exposures, and that is the way for them to improve in their vocabulary knowledge. Another study that I saw confirmed the results from the previous study on the previous slide. It showed that direct instruction was an important part of vocabulary learning. It also showed that students needed many contexts for the words to be exposed to or exposed in, and that students needed to be actively engaged in their vocabulary knowledge. They needed to be able to make connections to their vocabulary. That led me to a study that was conducted in 2006, and it explained that explicit vocabulary instruction improved the overall vocabulary understanding for students and it improved that by 12% more than another vocabulary method. But this did not give a specific vocabulary method. It just stated explicit vocabulary instruction. So that drove me to look at different methods of explicit vocabulary instruction that was different than what I was already teaching. That led me to the Frayer model. This is a graphic organizer that includes the definition, examples, non-examples, and characteristics. So what the students do is they place the word in the center of this graphic organizer. They use student-friendly dictionaries or the internet to come up with the definition of the word. They then determine characteristics of the word as well as examples and non-examples. So that provided students with connections to the text or to the words using the examples and the non-examples. My hypothesis was that 6th grade students who were taught vocabulary using the Frayer model will show greater improvements in vocabulary instruction in vocabulary knowledge compared to students using explicit vocabulary instruction. So the control group had the explicit instruction, which was the teacher explicitly saying this is the definition of the word, so students would write down the definition. The teacher also provided students with the word used in a sentence, and the students had to draw a picture of the word or a picture representing the word and had to share a synonym or antonym for the word. So that was the explicit instruction compared to the Frayer model for vocabulary instruction. The independent variable was the Frayer model as implemented in vocabulary instruction, and the dependent variable was the student's vocabulary, and that was measured through weekly assessments as well as an analysis of the growth on the IO assessments in the area of vocabulary. The purpose was to find out if the Frayer model would be an effective vocabulary model, and that was to increase the understanding of vocabulary words. Overall, I wanted students to be able to improve their vocabulary knowledge, and that would allow them to be more successful in all of their classes. I used the AB research design, so I had a control group, and that was the group that received the explicit vocabulary instruction, the traditional explicit vocabulary instruction, and the experimental group received the Frayer model as its vocabulary method. This was the most appropriate research design to determine accurate results to see if this vocabulary method was effective. So this leads me to my participants. I had 18 sixth graders in each class. Of those sixth graders, 3 students in each class were ELL students. They were receiving ELL services. 3 students were IEP students, and 4 students per class were identified as tag students. The students were given a pre-test and a post-test each week for 7 weeks, and that was for each class. And they were given the same pre-test and the same post-test. Each class received 45 minutes of instruction. The control group received 45 minutes of traditional explicit vocabulary instruction, and the experimental group received 45 minutes of the Frayer model. During that time, over the course of those 7 weeks, I collected the data. I determined the growth for each student from the pre-test to the post-test, and I determined the average growth for each section, and I also determined the average growth on the Iowa assessments. Based on my data collection and analysis, the hypothesis was not confirmed. Although both sections did improve, the independent t-test showed that there was not a significant growth to warrant a confirmation of the hypothesis for the experimental group. So here I have a graph that shows each of the quizzes. So if you look, you'll see that it goes quiz 1 through quiz 7. The experimental group is the yellow bar, and the control group is the blue bar. And so what this graph shows is the average number of words improved for each class, for each group, for each of the quizzes, for each of the tests. And so as you can see, they're all pretty close, and I'm going to talk about quiz 2 here in a minute, but the rest of the quizzes showed a growth somewhere between 0.5 words and close to 2.5 words. This table shows one of the vocabulary quizzes, and this was the one that I said before. This is quiz 2. Using the independent samples t-test, I was able to determine the mean growth and the standard deviation. So the control group had a negative 0.222 mean growth, the standard deviation of 1.592 in 18 students, and the experimental group had an average of 1.556 with a standard deviation of 2.595, and this gave the result of 2.478 with the t-sample and the independent t-sample with a p-value of 0.018. So that effect did show a significant result for that test. As you can see in Table E, this shows a more consistent result than the previous table. So I typically saw about an average growth of 2 to 2.3 words for each group. So if you look here, there's only a 0.389 difference in the mean. The t-sample result showed a 0.769 with a p-value of 0.447. This was more consistent throughout the rest of the results, as well as the Iowa assessment test. The Iowa assessment scores did not show an average growth that was that much different between the two groups. There were a few limitations to the test or to this research. The first one is that there were not enough vocabulary words to make that much of a difference, so a significant difference in the averages. The second limitation is that the students could have performed really well in the pretest, which would not provide them with the opportunity to make a high amount of growth between the pretest and the post-test. A third limitation is that I, as their teacher, was not able to control the other exposures that they may have to the words outside of my classroom. And then the last limitation is that students may not have been as familiar with the model, the Frayer model, as they were with other models of vocabulary instruction. This could have had an impact on their performance and their understanding of, the more familiar they are with a model, the more they would be able to make connections to the words, because they aren't worried about the how of how they're learning the words, just worried about the connections that they make. So that leads me to the future research. One way to address the limitations would be to have students have more time spent with the model before they actually had their data collection. Maybe instead of testing each week, the students could have been tested every other week so that they had more words, so they were able to improve by more words. They also I could have tested them at the beginning of the unit. So there were 3 units throughout the course of the 7 weeks, and so I could have just tested them at the beginning of the unit, at the end of the unit, and maybe they would have improved by more words. Really, further research needs to be done to find a different explicit model and one that is more effective than the Frayer model. Another way would be to use the Iowa assessments or another standardized test or another assessment model that would account for knowing the word during the pretest and not having growth to the post-test. To show that there is no correlation, we really need to conduct more research to better find a research method or a vocabulary method that is going to be more effective. This does confirm the prior studies, the results that they saw, and I will be sharing these results with the 5-6 teachers as well as my building principal.